Hi, boys and girls. It's Mr. Chalfant, and we are back with Chapter 3 in our book, Henry Huggins. And in the first chapter, if you remember, we read all about how Henry, where am I going to go to it? Let's see. There it is. How Henry met Ribsy and brought him home. And you remember that was pretty exciting to come home in the police car. And in Chapter 2, we read about Henry getting 2 little guppies, and then all of a sudden having so many guppies he could hardly have room in his bedroom for them. And he brought them all back, and he ended up with a nice catfish in a tropical fish tank. So that was kind of a fun adventure that he had. And in Chapter 3, we're going to read about Henry and the night crawlers. Have you ever almost had something you really wanted, but then you lost it? And what would you do if you wanted to try to get it back? What did Henry do? And what kind of kid is Henry, and how did his parents help? So how would you describe Henry at this point? You've kind of gotten to know him through 3 different chapters. What kind of kid is he? I would say he's responsible. He's a little bit adventurous, I guess. He likes to have fun and be with his friends. Anyway, we're going to read about Henry and the night crawlers, so follow along. When Henry came back from school one Friday late in September, he shook all his nickels and dimes and pennies out of a marble sack onto his bedspread. Have you ever done that? Have you ever counted all the coins that you have? It's kind of fun to save them up for something. His expenses had been heavy, and he knew he did not have much money left. The first thing he had done after finding Ribsy was to pay for his license and buy him a collar. Naturally, he didn't want his dog to eat from an old chipped dish, so he had spent 69 cents for a red plastic dish with DOG printed on it. This nearly exhausted his savings. He had spent his silver dollar on the guppies and all his allowance to take care of them. Then he had sold the guppies for $7 and spent all $7 for the tank and the thermostat for the catfish. And remember, his dad decided he would buy the catfish for him. At breakfast this morning, his father had given him his weekly 25 cents. Besides that, he had 6 cents saved from last week's allowance. He also had a nickel that he had found in the park. And then there was his Canadian dime. He could try to spend that, but he hated to after keeping it almost a whole year. He might want to start a coin collection sometime. With the Canadian dime, he had 46 cents. Not counting 9 cents that he could get for 3 old milk bottles he had found in a vacant lot on the way home from school. So you see, he does recycling too and can get money for it. It was still not enough. Henry needed $13.95 plus 41 cents for tax. Henry needed all this money because he wanted to buy a football, a real football from a sporting goods store, not just a toy football from a department store. This time he wanted a genuine cowhide football stitched with nylon thread and laced with buckskin thongs. Every boy on Klickitat Street wanted one. As Henry looked at the money spread out on his bed, he heard someone calling, "Henry!" Henry went to the front door. There on the front porch stood Scooter McCarthy. Henry was surprised because Scooter didn't often come to play with him. He was a 5th grader, and he was bigger than Henry. Henry was even more surprised when he saw what Scooter was holding, a real cowhide football, stitched with nylon thread and laced with real buckskin thongs. "Hiya, Scoot," said Henry. "Boy, oh boy, where did you get that football?" "My grandmother sent it to me for my birthday," answered Scooter. "Your grandmother?" Henry could hardly believe it. "My grandmother sends me sweaters and socks." "Oh, not my grandmother. She sends me real keen presents. Come on out and let's throw some passes." Scooter pounded the football with his fist. It made a drum-like sound. Henry could hardly wait to touch the leather. When the boys, followed by Ribsy, went out to the sidewalk, Scooter ran up the street a ways and threw the ball back to Henry. It hit some branches that overhung the sidewalk, but Henry caught it anyway. The ball felt just right. It was big and solid, and it smelled of new leather. Henry lovingly ran his hands over its surface before he sent it sailing back to Scooter, but the ball hit the branches again. I know what, said Scooter. If I went on the other side of the street and we threw it back and forth across the street, we wouldn't hit the trees. He tucked the ball under his arm as if he were running 90 yards for a touchdown and sprinted across the street. Now, boys and girls, you can see the picture there. They're throwing the ball back and forth across the street. Do you think that's a good idea? Pow! The ball sailed into Henry's hands. It made a deep, hollow sound, just the kind of sound that a good football should make. Henry sent it right back across the street. Pow! Scooter caught it. Back and forth the ball flew until Henry's hands began to tingle from the smack of the leather against them. Throw it to me one more time, called Scooter, and then let's go down to the empty lot and we can practice kicking. Henry wished that he could carry the ball, but after all, it did belong to Scooter. He gripped it firmly and he drew it back over his shoulder. This time, he was going to throw a perfect pass, the kind that he had seen All-Americans make in the movies. As he started to bring his arm forward, Ribsy gave a sudden bark. Henry looked around at Ribsy, but his arm kept on going. The ball left his fingers. Just at that instant, a car whizzed around the corner. Scooter yelled, "Hey, look out!" But it was too late. There was nothing Henry could do. The speeding car did not slow down, and for one terrible moment, he thought the ball was going to hit the driver. Instead, it sailed into the rear window, bounced against the closed window on the other side of the car, and then fell inside. The car raced on down the street and screeched around the corner on two wheels. The football and the car were gone. The boys just stared after the car. Henry was so surprised, he just stood there with his arms still in the air. When he finally remembered to bring it down, he was still speechless. "My football!" exclaimed Scooter. He stopped looking down the street after the departed car, and he looked at Henry. "My ball is in that car," he said accusingly. "Yeah, I guess it is," Henry said uncomfortably. "Maybe the man in the car will bring it back in a little while," he said hopefully. "He'd better," said Scooter grimly. The boy sat down on the curb to wait. "Boy, I bet he was going 80 miles an hour, said Henry. "I couldn't even see his license plates." "He ought to be arrested," said Henry, who was anxious to talk about anything but Scooter's football. "He might kill somebody," said Scooter. The boys waited and waited. The longer they waited, the more angry Scooter looked. "I don't think that car is going to come back," he said finally. "It's all your fault. You threw the ball." "Yes, I know," admitted Henry, "but it wasn't my fault that Ribsy barked and that old car came by just then." "You shouldn't have thrown it." Scooter scowled at Henry. "I couldn't help it," Henry scowled back. "I didn't even see the car until after I threw the ball. I couldn't catch it after I had thrown it, could I?" "I don't care. You would have heard the car coming if that dumb old dog of yours hadn't made so much noise. He wasn't even barking at anything. You lost my new ball, and you're going to have to buy me a new one. And if you don't, I'll... Scooter wasn't quite sure what he would do, so he didn't finish his sentence. Henry didn't know what to say. It didn't seem right that he was to blame, but still, half an hour ago, Scooter had had a new football, and now it was gone, and Henry had been the last one to touch it. "I have 46 cents and 3 milk bottles you could have," said Henry hopefully. He hated to see that football disappear almost as much as Scooter did. "That isn't enough," said Scooter. "You'll have to buy me a new football before next Saturday, or I'll tell my dad, and he'll tell your dad, and then you'll really get it." Henry suspected that Scooter was right. He probably would get it. Once, when he had accidentally broken another boy's roller skate, his father had given him a talking to and then made him spend his allowance to have it fixed. "Okay," he said. "I'll get you a new football. I don't know how, but I guess I'll manage." Henry turned and went slowly into the house. Ribsy followed him. "Now see what you've done?" Henry said. And after I spent my football money for your license and your collar and your dish too. Ribsy just hung his head. Now Henry was just twice as far from owning a real cowhide football with nylon stitching and buckskin lacings as he had been half an hour ago. He was quiet for the rest of the afternoon, and all through dinner. He was thinking. How about another piece of gingerbread? His father asked. No, thank you, said Henry absent-mindedly. May I be excused, please? Why, Henry, don't you feel well? Mrs. Huggins was surprised. Henry usually ate 2 pieces of gingerbread, and even a third if she let him. Oh, sure, I feel all right, said Henry, and he went out to sit on the front steps. Ribsy lay on the step below and dozed with his head on Henry's foot. Good old Ribsy, even if you did get me into trouble, said Henry. He listened to the whish, click of the water sprinkler next door, and he wondered how he was going to earn $13.95 in 1 week. He thought and thought. He could collect old tin foil. No, that would take too long. Junkmen didn't want the little wads of tin foil that you could find on the ground. They wanted big pieces that were too hard to find. Maybe he could ask the neighbors for old papers and magazines. No, he had already collected all that he could find for a school paper drive the week before. Besides that, junkmen paid only half a cent a pound. He could open a lemonade stand by the park. But lemonade stands were just kid stuff. Mothers and fathers were the only people who really spent any money on lemonade. He could charge 50 cents for mowing lawns. That would be $1 for 2 lawns. He would have to mow, boys and girls, that's a math problem right there. 50 cents for each lawn, 2 lawns for $1, and he's got to earn $13.95. So that's almost $14. 14 lawns, $14. How many lawns would he have to do? I see some of your hands. 28 lawns. He would have to mow 28 lawns to earn $13.95. Even if he could get 28 lawns to mow, he didn't see how he could find time after school. As the evening grew darker, Henry still sat on the steps thinking and listening to the whish, click of the water sprinkler. Whish, click, whish, click. Then Mr. Hector Grumby, who lived next door, came out of the house and shut off the water. Henry liked Mr. Grumby, but he wasn't so sure about Mrs. Grumby. She sprinkled Doggy Be Gone on all of her bushes, and Ribsy did not like that smell very much. Henry noticed that Mr. Grumby had a flashlight in one hand and a quart fruit jar in the other. Mr. Grumby set the jar on the sidewalk, tiptoed onto the lawn, flashed his light on the grass, bent over, and pounced on something. Then he picked it up and put it into the jar. It was too dark for Henry to see what it was. The next time Mr. Grumby pounced, he didn't put anything into the jar. Henry heard him mutter, "Oops, that one got away." Henry couldn't stand it any longer. He had to know what Mr. Grumby was doing. He walked across his own lawn and peered over the rose bushes. "If you come any closer," said Mr. Grumby, "you'd better tiptoe. I don't want to scare them away." "Scare what away?" asked Henry. "Night crawlers," said Mr. Grumby. "Night crawlers?" exclaimed Henry. "What are night crawlers?" "Worms," said Mr. Grumby. "Great big worms. Do you mean to say you've lived here all these years and you've never seen a night crawler?" "No, I haven't," answered Henry. "How big are they?" "Oh, about 7 to 10 inches long." Golly, Henry could hardly believe it. 10 inches long? I didn't know worms came that big. "Here's one." Mr. Grumby swooped down and held up a worm in the beam of his flashlight. It was a big, fat worm. It was at least 9 inches long and as big around as a pencil. Can you imagine finding a worm that big? "Wow," said Henry. It was hard to believe, but there it was. Mr. Grumby put it into the jar. "Do you use them to catch fish?" asked Henry. "That's right." Mr. Grumby pounced again. What kind of fish? Oh, some kinds of trout, salmon, perch, catfish, all different kinds of fish. I'm going salmon fishing on the Columbia River in the morning. Henry thought this over. Do you always catch worms at night? Yes, they only come out at night when the ground is wet. I give the lawn a good soaking so they'll come up to the top, and then I turn on the light and grab them quick before they have a chance to pull back into the ground. Mr. Grumby stepped out on the porch and Mrs. Grumby stepped out onto the porch and called to her husband. Hector, if you expect me to have a lunch ready for you to take fishing at 3 o'clock in the morning, you'd better go to the store for a loaf of bread right now before it closes. All right, in a minute. As his wife went back into the house, Mr. Grumby said to Henry, How would you like to earn some money? Catching worms? I'll say I would. I'll pay you a penny apiece for every night crawler you can catch. Golly, said Henry, a penny apiece? How many do you want? As many as you can catch. If I can't use them, some of the other men can. He handed Henry the jar and the flashlight, got into his car, and drove away. A penny apiece. There were 1,000 pennies in it. There were 100 pennies in a dollar, so it would take 1,395 worms to pay for the football, and 41 worms for the tax. Henry went around the rose bushes and tiptoed across the grass. Because of the doggy bee gone, Ribsy stayed on his own side of the rose bushes. Henry turned on the flashlight, and sure enough, there on the grass was the end of a big fat worm. But when Henry bent to pick it up, it was gone. He tiptoed farther across the grass and turned on the light again. This time he moved faster. He grabbed the end of the cold, slippery worm. The other end was already in the ground. Henry pulled and the worm pulled. The worm stretched. It grew longer and thinner until it snapped out of Henry's hand and disappeared into the ground. "Ugh," said Henry. The next time he moved still faster. He pounced on the worm before either end had a chance to get in the ground. He caught it. That's 1 penny, he thought. After that, it was easier. He caught most of the worms on the first pounce. Pretty soon, he had caught 62 worms. Then he discovered he was running out of worms. Either he had caught all of Mr. Grumby's worms, or they had felt him walking around on the ground, and they had retired for the night. And he hadn't earned enough money to pay for the football. Just as Henry was wondering where he could find more worms, Mr. Grumby came back from the store. "I caught 62 worms for you," said Henry. 62? That's great. Mr. Grumby reached into his pants pocket and brought out a handful of change. He picked out a 50-cent piece, a dime, and 2 pennies and gave them to Henry. "Thank you," said Henry politely. He wished that he had caught more worms. Mr. Grumby started to go into the house, and then he stopped. "Say, Shorty," he said to Henry, who was going back through the rose bushes, "I'll tell you what you can do. Sunday morning, I'm going fishing with a bunch of men from my club. Quite a few of us are going, and we can use all the worms that you can catch. Tomorrow night, you get someone to help you and catch enough for all of us." "Sure," said Henry. "I'll catch hundreds of worms for you." "That's great. We can use them," answered Mr. Grumby as he went back into the house. Henry sat down on his front steps again. Because he needed so much money, he knew that he would have to catch all of the worms by himself. That meant he would need a lot of wet lawn. His mother would be pleased, even surprised, to have him offer to water the lawn, but his lawn and the Grumby's lawn still wouldn't be enough. Maybe he could ask all the people on the street to water their yard Saturday evening. But if he did that, Beezus and Robert and all the other kids would ask what he was doing. And Henry was afraid that they would want to earn money catching worms too. He knew that Beezus would want to. She was the kind of girl who would like catching worms. Henry sat on the steps wishing that he had acres and acres of wet lawn. He thought and thought about millions of wet, green blades of grass with big fat worms peeping out from under them. The park. Of course, that was it. It was only a few blocks away, and because September had been unusually warm this year. The grass in the park was watered every day. If his mother would let him stay up later than 9 o'clock, he knew that he could catch enough worms to pay for that football. Henry went into the living room where his mother was knitting an argyle sock. "Mom, could I stay up later tomorrow night?" Henry told his mother the whole story. Mrs. Huggins put down the sock. "Henry," she sighed, "how do you manage to get yourself into such messes?" "Well, gee," said Henry, "I didn't do anything. I just threw this football and—" "Yes, you told me," his mother interrupted. "Yes, you may stay up tomorrow night, but for goodness sakes, Henry, after this, do be careful with other people's belongings." Saturday was an anxious day for Henry. He wanted to avoid Scooter, but he also wanted to go to the park to make sure the grass was being watered. Unfortunately, he had to pass right by Scooter's house to reach the park. He walked on the other side of the street, but Scooter was in his front yard tightening the chain on his bicycle. He shook his fist at Henry and yelled, "You get me that ball or I'll fix you." "You and who else?" Henry yelled back and kept on going. When he reached the park, he was relieved to hear the swish of the sprinklers and see water spraying all over the grass. He would earn $13.95 before he went to bed that night. That evening, Henry did not even wait for dessert. He borrowed his father's flashlight and several old mayonnaise jars and ran down the hill to the park. It was a warm night, and the tennis courts and the swimming pool were floodlighted. It was only beginning to get dark, but Henry hoped it might be dark enough underneath the bushes to start catching worms, and he could not afford to waste any time. He passed the playground where he heard the children shouting and the clank and clang of the rings and the swings. Henry didn't stop. He had work to do. He went to the edge of the park where there were no lights, and he turned on his flashlight. And sure enough, there in the grass underneath the bush was a night crawler. Henry nabbed it and put it into his jar. Then he caught another. He caught worm after worm. 431, 432, 433. Henry was tired of pouncing. Henry was tired of worms. When the lights of the swimming pool went off, Henry was still working. By the time that the lights at the tennis courts went off, Henry was very, very tired of worms, but he kept on going. When he had added the 1,103rd worm to his collection, he heard someone calling, "Henry? Henry, where are you?" It was his mother. "Here I am." As Henry stood up to rest his aching back, he saw his mother and father walking along the path. "My goodness, Henry," Mrs. Huggins exclaimed, "haven't you caught those worms yet? You can't stay out in the park all night long." "But Mom, I still don't have enough worms to pay for Scooter's football, and I promised to get him a new one this week. I have 1,103 worms, and I need to catch 1,331 altogether. I had some money saved and I earned some last night." "Let's see now. He needs 228 more. It shouldn't take too long to catch them," Mr. Huggins said to Mrs. Huggins. "After all, he promised. Let's help him." So, Henry and his mother and father bent and pounced together. Henry felt a little uncomfortable to see his mother catching worms, but he was very, very glad when the 1,331st worm was in the jar. He took his jar of worms to Mr. Grumby, who paid him $13.31. As Henry watched him turn the night crawlers into a box of dirt so they would live until Sunday, he thought he never wanted to see another worm. He felt the money in his pocket. "I guess this ought to take care of old Scooter," he said, and wishing that he could spend it on a football for himself, he went home to bed. Sunday morning, Henry lay on his stomach on the living room floor reading the funny papers. Usually he woke up early and read the funnies before his mother and father were awake, but this morning he was so tired from catching worms that he slept later than usual. The doorbell rang and Mr. Huggins, who was reading the sports section and drinking coffee, put down his paper and answered the door. Henry heard a strange man ask, "Excuse me, could you tell me who owns this football?" Henry didn't wait for his father to answer. He ran to the door. The man was holding Scooter's real cowhide football, stitched with nylon thread and laced with buckskin thongs. "Golly," said Henry, "that's the football I lost for Scooter McCarthy." The man handed it to Henry. "I'm sorry I couldn't stop when the ball landed in my car. I had to take my wife to the hospital in a hurry. I would have returned it sooner, but I couldn't leave the kids." "That's okay," said Henry. "Gee, thanks for bringing it back." When the man had gone, Henry showed the football to his father. "You see, Dad," he said, "this is the kind of football I'm going to buy with my Nightcrawler money." Then he tucked the football under his arm as if he were running 90 yards for a touchdown, and he sprinted down the street to Scooter's house. And boys and girls, Henry got out of his problem again. Henry and the Nightcrawlers, I hope you enjoyed that chapter. Tomorrow we're going to read about the Green Christmas. Have you heard of a white Christmas? Well, this one's the Green Christmas. We'll find out more tomorrow. Bye for now.